So hello everyone, my name is Amanda Oliver and I'm the head of Archives and Special Collections at the Laurier Library. Thank you so much for joining us today for the 2023 Climate Action Week panel. We would like to acknowledge that Wilfrid University and its campuses are located on the shared traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dishwith-Spoon Treaty. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to the land where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which Laurier is now present. We encourage you to consider the traditional lands you are joining us from today. This inaugural event is a collaboration between the Laurier Library, Laurier Sustainability Office, and the Wilfrid Laurier University Faculty Association Climate Action Committee to celebrate the Ontario Library Association's Climate Action Week. The goal of this week is to focus on the climate change-related challenges and emergencies facing our communities and to demonstrate that libraries are places to connect people and resources on climate change. Before I introduce our moderator, we would like to go over a few Zoom housekeeping items. So you are muted and your video is turned off. We invite you to sit back and enjoy the panel. Captions are enabled for this webinar. If you would benefit from captions, please click on the button with the CC icon along the bottom of your screen to enable this feature. We will be utilizing the Q&A function today. So to ask a question, please click on the Q&A button along the bottom of your screen, and we'll be taking questions at the end of the panel. So please add your questions as they come to you. And this session is being recorded. I would now like to introduce Eric Meliton. Eric is the manager of the Sustainability Office at Wilfrid Laurier University and the moderator for today's panel. So please join me in welcoming Eric.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you, CU, for your support from Library Services. We're excited to be co-hosting this panel with everybody. We really wanted to showcase the breadth and experience of our panelists, and so as my opening question as part of the moderating group, we actually wanted to use a question to introduce each of our panelists. So we're going to start with, this is a universal question for everybody. We're going to start with Denise. How does your work at Laurier positively impact our shared climate future?
Yes, thank you. So, hi, can you all hear me? Excellent. So, I am technically a PhD candidate in English and Film Studies, but in the last year or so, I've been working with the Sustainability Office, Ellisburg, and the Laurier Library Makerspace to organize events around slow fashion and sort of mending and sewing techniques. And then currently I'm sitting on the Menstrual Equity Committee, both as a person with experience using sustainable and reusable menstrual products and also as someone who's really interested in making those accessible and equitable to the entire Laurier community.
Great, thanks, Denise. I'm going to ask Bryce the same question on your side. How does your work at Laurier positively impact our shared climate future?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the work that our research group produces comes out in policy briefs, policy reports, and things like that go back to the provincial government. So a lot of the work that we do, when I think about how it builds, positivity, is that a lot of our focus is on giving understudied spaces and especially like rural communities a voice, because often in their communities, they just aren't being heard by decision makers that are in, Toronto, making decisions for small communities all around the province. And so that's really what I think specifically our little research group sort of helps accomplish on that front.
Fantastic, Bryce. Thank you. A lot of important research on that front. To our next panelist, Danve, how does your work at Laurier positively impact our shared climate future?
Thank you very much for that question, Eric, and thank you very much for the invitation and also to CU for the invitation for this panel. So I'm an assistant professor and principal investigator in the Department of Biology, and I'm plant molecular biologist broadly interested in investigating how climate change associated factors impact plant health. And I'm currently focusing on plant responses to infectious diseases. So looking at what are these molecular components and mechanisms of the plant immune system that are rendered vulnerable by changing and challenging factors due to climate change. And once we have this conceptual and fundamental understanding of these climate vulnerable components, can we eventually develop and generate innovative technologies in order to increase or enhance resilience of plant immune systems? So that can be through the power of genetics, like genome editing, or even more collaborative research in terms of looking at bio-based biostimulant, microbe-based technologies, and even a nanotechnology in order to increase immune resilience.
Very exciting research, Danve. It's a good segue. So CU is actually going to be bringing up your presentation. We're going to start with your presentation first. We're asking our audience to listen in on each of our panelists' 8 to 10 minute window. Think of questions. CU is going to be kind of collating questions for us to ask. And as we go along, we'll actually have an opportunity for you to kind of ask these questions directly. So please listen in, learn about the research, learn about the work. Danve, you're up first.
Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, my program is broadly interested in investigating the impacts of climate change, specifically a warming climate on plant immune systems, and how we can develop and engineer strategies to strengthen plant immune resilience. So I assume I don't have control with the slides, so I'll just say next slide, please. So before I start, just like a few and brief acknowledgement of our research team in the Department of Biology, so current lab members and lab alumni, which encompass PhD, master's, and undergraduate students that have really been instrumental in the success of this research. And of course, in terms of that quote, "No man is an island," that's the same in science, that we need our collaborative networks and interdisciplinarity in order to arrive at good solutions and complete or near complete answers to the questions we want to answer. Next slide, please. So this is something that I always like to put as an intro to my program. And the warming stripes that you could see to the left, that really underscores the important fact that global average temperatures have definitely increased through the decades. As you can see that there's a lot of red in most recent years and decades, and it has become much warmer based on various observations and metrics. And where I come in is my expertise in plant molecular biology, especially with plant microbe interactions, because we know that the interaction of host plants with infectious pathogens is greatly influenced and intercepted by a changing environment. And this is the plant disease triangle concept, which even extends beyond plants. So human diseases are also governed by these disease triangle concept. So we are quite interested how these changing environmental conditions, especially warming temperatures, impact plant pathogen interactions, and thus the robustness of the plant immune system. Next slide, please. So in our lab, we use model systems, and in this case, Arabidopsis plant. So this is the lab rat of plant science research. So when we expose Arabidopsis plants to moderately elevated temperatures that are simulating natural heat waves, we could see changes in growth, as you could see morphological changes in there, which we term thermoresponsive growth or thermomorphogenesis, if we get too jargony. But apart from growth responses, there's also defense responses. So I think it's the next animation. In terms of the immune system, wherein higher temperatures lead to increased susceptibility to disease. And as you can see, plants have increased symptoms when infected by pathogens. And this is due to the dual impact of elevated temperature in suppressing host immunity and also increasing the virulence of various pathogens, which can promote outbreaks, severity, and even abundance of these pathogens in natural settings. In my lab, I am quite focused on salicylic acid, and in this case, next slide, please. We've been looking at quite like a lot of data sets in Arabidopsis and in various crops like tomato, that this salicylic acid defense hormone is suppressed at elevated temperature. So this is in collaboration with our other scientists in the US, including at Duke University with Shengyang He and Jung-Hum Kim. So the question is like, why is this salicylic acid defense immune signal suppressed at elevated temperature? So we did a lot of investigation. Next slide, please. And then yes, what we found out is that normal plants typically have this SA suppressed because its genetic switch is turned off at elevated temperature. So we use the power of genetic engineering. So next animation, please. In order to engineer plants wherein this switch doesn't turn off. And indeed, when we measured salicylic acid hormone levels, next animation, please, we were able to restore this production at elevated temperature. So we were quite happy with that particular discovery. So next slide, please. So indeed, there are ramifications in terms of the immune response. So normal plants are more susceptible at higher temperature. Next animation, please. And while those that are engineered are more resilient, so we have been able to increase this resilience in model systems. And the next slide, please. So why are plants more susceptible during warm conditions? So we were able to pinpoint this temperature vulnerable step, which is the salicylic acid defense hormone pathway. Next animation, please. And then can we repair plants that are more vulnerable to temperature? And yes, we can use the power of genetic engineering to really look at these vulnerable points and repair them. Next animation, please. And then these plants have physiologically relevant outcomes. So next animation, please, wherein they're more resilient to climate warming. And then finally, next animation, can this be useful for other crops? And indeed, there are clues that this can be used as a genetic roadmap for other plants because a lot of these genes are found not just in model plants, but also in agriculturally important crops in Canada. And with that, I would just like to close with this amazing image that my colleague, Dr. Tristan Long in the Department of Biology constructed when we were trying to promote the paper when we published it last year. Thank you.
Danve, thank you for your presentation. I've seen that image on social media, so it's fantastic that you're able to share that here. We also have just added Robert McLeman, so he's going to be introducing himself in the next presentation after Bryce. So Bryce, we're going to pass it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. All right, so I'm just presenting a bit of work that we do with our research group out of Brantford. We're called the Resilient Communities Research Collaborative. I'm currently a research coordinator in the Faculty of Liberal Arts at the Brantford campus. I'm also a part-time instructor and a few other sort of hats, but this is majorly what I'm doing right now. If you can just go to the next slide, please. All right, so our research group was founded in 2012 by Dr. Brenda Murphy and Dr. Annette Chrétien. I just wanted to mention up front that Dr. Annette Chrétien is a Métis woman. And for some of the Indigenous work that we've done with our group, she usually leads that front. So I just want to mention up front that it's always important to get, Indigenous people. You lead the research for Indigenous people, and it's not just white people. Projecting their views onto that. So the specific focus of our group is really on rural and Aboriginal resilience. And I wanted to go over some of our research specifically around maple syrup. And as I mentioned, just sort of in the introduction there, our research really speaks to perspectives from understudied and rural and indigenous spaces. And our, kind of our overarching goal of the work that we do is to try and give voice to those who don't always have the opportunity to be heard. And those are especially important in rural communities and indigenous spaces, as well as, near North Ontario. So our research usually goes up to around kind of the Sudbury kind of area, and then anything, or maybe Wawa would be about the extent, but usually more north of that is real kind of northern studies. Just the next slide would be great. So in terms of our maple syrup research, basically how this all started was Annette Chrétien's father noticed that the maple trees were dying, and he was wondering why. And so that's kind of the spark of the research. And so we use maple syrup and sugar maples as a way of sort of tapping into our different knowledges in order to understand the potential effects of climate change especially in rural and understudied spaces. Next slide. So we landed funding for two projects. One was through OMAFRA to look at sort of the innovation and capacity development, and basically ways that you can get more value out of the maple trees that you have. And then our second research study was funded by SSHRC, and that was was a longitudinal study which looked at past data back to the 1700s to today, and then future casting from today to 2100 to understand basically how do we get to know what we know about maple syrup, and then how do we prepare, or how do we ensure that maple syrup can be produced, and how do we understand it will be produced in the next 100 years, given that maple syrup and specifically maple trees are so susceptible to climate change. So those were kind of the two streams of our work over the past decade or so. Next slide, please. So basically what makes maple syrup so interesting to look at is it's only produced in basically in North America, in that small red portion there. And so Canada produces, around like, I don't know, what is it, about 80% or so of the world's supply. And, Quebec produces the most in Ontario, and then some parts of the States as well. And why it's sort of susceptible to climate change is that if you've ever done a maple syrup, tour or whatever in Elmira, you sort of learn that it requires very specific set of temperatures, specifically sort of -5 during night and then +5 during the day, to kind of create like a pumping effect that, gets the sap out of the trees. And of course, the trees themselves have to be around for a long time before they can be tapped. So you're looking at 40 or 50 years in the past just to sort of start to have that that supply of maple. So it's an interesting kind of tree to look at in terms of climate change. Next slide, please. So why do we pursue impacts of climate change on maple syrup? So that was kind of what I was asking myself in putting this presentation together, is why do we do this? Well, a lot of it is the importance of valued ecosystems across time. So we're sort of understanding, how does maple syrup contribute to rural resiliency? Maple syrup is the first crop harvested in the spring. It's important to a lot of local communities. Places like Elmira, for example, have a lot of tourist dollars with the Elmira Maple Syrup Festival, and all those sorts of things contribute to rural resiliency as well. And then in terms of climate change impacting those, how do we know what is happening? How do we know what's going to happen? And of course, it all sort of takes research as well. So, and we also kind of view this, Brenda Murphy is very much a scholar in environmental justice, and we kind of have that aspect as well to our work. Rural spaces are understudied, yet they have a smaller carbon footprint, yet rural spaces are expected to do more with less. So rural spaces are expected, for example, to take on the waste from urban centers and then bring in food and stuff to feed those urban centers. There's always that underlying tension between the urban and rural and those sorts of issues. And those really come up when you start talking about climate change issues as well. Next slide, please. So why is this research important? Well, specifically for the maple syrups work, it sort of assesses settler and indigenous archival and oral history. So, kind of records and brings some of that information out. It evaluates the biophysical management practices and promising adaptation strategies. So how are we preparing for climate change? How do maple syrup producers adapt to climate change? What's going on with that? We produced some future impact forest forecast maps. And, at a scholarly level, it provides a lot of knowledge on how do we integrate different knowledges into a coherent understanding of climate change. So how do we, when you look at a settler perspective of maple syrup, they might value the economic aspect of maple syrup. But when you look at it as well as from an indigenous standpoint, they see value as a different set of values, like in terms of the value of maple syrup, in terms of bringing people together, in terms of first tap ceremonies, these other sort of different values. And we try and sort of highlight some of that information on that. Perfect. So how does it help how does this research, help people? Well, as I mentioned, it incorporates a lot of silent voices. When we did this research in the field, people were always like, oh my God, university, cares about maple syrup. You guys are on a maple farm, you're trying to get this information. And it impacts a lot of different groups. So just the kind of the pictures at the bottom there, those are some of the benefactors and contributors to this knowledge. But you have First Nations, you have maple syrup institutes, you have the government as well, universities. There's a lot of people with different, a lot of stakeholders at play. Next slide, please. So in terms of the maple syrup, that's kind of the gist of where we've gone with that. We've transitioned a little bit more into rural municipal research. It's again still looking at understudied spaces, but we basically kind of over the past 10 years got about as far as we can get with maple in terms of what we can do with it. Now we're looking at rural spaces a little bit more broadly, specifically looking at their ability to adapt to climate change. And we've done a number of projects. This was another MAFRA funded project. And you can see some of the different groups or users of that research below, including the Rural Municipal Association, Good Roads Ontario, those sorts of things. So this specific group, this is just kind of another project that we did. Maybe just go to the next slide, actually. But really why this matters is what you see when things go wrong in terms of climate change. So these are a few pictures here from Wawa. This is from a project that we did. Again, this is what's interesting about these pictures is that this is 5 years after the flood went through and nothing has been fixed. And so something that, again, when it gets back to environmental justice issue, these sorts of things, wouldn't happen necessarily in Southern Ontario, but they seem to happen in Northern Ontario, unfortunately. And then this picture here is again another climate change impact of Bruce, of a bridge that was washed out in Port Bruce. So yeah, I guess just the next slide would be great. So key takeaway messages then. Again, our focus is really on assessing and valuing voices and perspectives that are lacking. So again, rural, Indigenous, near North communities. And so our work at Laurier positively impacts our shared climate future. I guess I already kind of answered this, but ideally, we want to provide knowledge on climate change specifically to rural practitioners, policymakers, and get that voice heard, right? These voices are, again, if you're a small community, 200 people, you're just trying to keep the lights on, trying to keep the roads plowed, these sorts of things. How are you expected to adapt to climate change? How are you expected to do these different things given the downloading that's been going on ever since the Mike Harris Common Sense Revolution era? And this is where my doctoral research is sort of coming into this, is that, small communities need stable climate change adaptation funding. And we need to ensure that rural spaces are equitable, or receiving, climate change adaptation funding that is equitable, because up until now, rural communities are just simply expected to do more with less, and that's just not fair. So that's kind of the gist of our research group, and what some of the things that we're focusing on. So thank you.
Thank you, Bryce. Sounds like a lot of great research that you have on the go, and hopefully it gets you out of the field a lot too, right, in rural Ontario. So that's nice to hear. I'm gonna pass things over to Robert. I know, Robert, we're gonna add your introduction as part of your 10 minutes. The introduction question was, how does your work at Laurier positively impact our shared climate future? And feel free to segue that into what you wanted to discuss for today.
Thanks, Eric, and thank you everyone for joining us online. My apologies to the other panelists. My first year students were writing a midterm test today, and it finished at 10 to 1, and then I had to dash over here and join you folks. So anyhow, thanks for having me as part of this. It's a great panel. Thanks to the Ontario Library Association for being the catalyst for this, and for the Laurier Sustainability Office for their role as well. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I just wanted to briefly touch on a few things that we do here in my department and me personally on the teaching side of things and on the research side of things to contribute towards the broader societal effort to, for lack of a better word, do something about climate change. So as I mentioned, my first year students were writing their midterm test right now. I have 2 sections of 250 students each in my first year environmental studies course. We look at a broad range of environmental issues, from deforestation to desertification to environment and health, but we do spend quite a bit of time talking about climate change in terms of what are the physical drivers behind it, what are the impacts of it, who's vulnerable, and how do they adapt, and how can we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And the focus on that first year teaching is on not simply identifying the scope of the problem, but identifying the solutions pathways, and hopefully inspiring students to take a few more courses related to climate change, either on the physical side of things or on the social science side of things. And I think we're doing pretty well. Enrollment keeps going up year after year, and there's a lot of students on campus who are making a minor in environmental studies, even if you know their major is business or other sciences or arts. Pretty soon we're going to be launching a climate change not a minor, an option, a climate change option for students who want to specialize in understanding how do we manage the impacts of climate change. So that's going to be coming online within the next 12 to 24 months. Eventually, there will be an entire program at Meliton centered around climate change management at the Meliton campus whenever we get that off the ground for the environmental science side of things. So that's what I'm doing on the first year teaching side, which personally I think is one of my biggest contributions to dealing with environmental and climate change. Each year, and I've been doing this for, 15 years, I think, going on, certainly at Laurier, more than 10 years, teaching a new cohort of students each year. I also teach a second year course on Introduction to Sustainability, it's called. It's very much organized around community-based learning. So the students, and there's 150 of them in it, they get broken up into consulting teams, and then each year we pick a different rural community in Waterloo region, and we help them plan a more environmentally sustainable future. This year we are inflicting ourselves upon the community of New Dundee. Past years we've done Ayr, we've done Breslau, and so on, and we make a circle. And the reason we focus on rural communities in Waterloo region is that they typically don't have the resources the way the big cities do in terms of planning for sustainability. So the students essentially, they learn on the job about what planners do when they're thinking about sustainability, and we give back to those communities. In fact, the planner for Wilmot Township with whom we're working is actually a graduate of our program who did this thing over 10 years ago. So it goes around and comes around. Just a couple minutes briefly on my research contributions. I suppose I'm best known, I've got some bump around me here for this book on climate and human migration that I wrote nearly 10 years ago. In which that's where a lot of my research has been over the last 20 years, is on how changes in the climate affect migration patterns around the world, how it displaces people need to relocate or be relocated. So a lot of my work has been on that, both here in Canada, in the United States and abroad as well, working with teams of researchers from different institutions. Lots of grad students going through that program as well. I've also been involved in this citizen science project that you see behind me here. I don't know if you can see all of it. I got a smaller one here. It's called Rink Watch. So what we do is we have a website, rinkwatch.org, and it's been running for 10 years now here at Laurier. We invite people around North America who have outdoor skating rinks in their backyard to submit data to our online portal. And then we use that data to understand how winter conditions are changing, how the climate is changing, and how that impacts people's backyard skating rinks. Now, in the greater scheme of things, is probably a minor thing when we think about all the wider impacts that climate change is having on our communities. But what this project does is it gives people who are sitting in their van in the Tim Hortons drive-through line, shuttling the kids to and from hockey practice, a way that they can better connect with and understand environmental science. Because really that's what it's about, is trying to communicate how the climate is changing to the wider public. And we've had a lot of students at Laurier go through it. We've had a huge amount of media interest over the years on it. The final thing I'd mention is that because of all of this work that I've been doing over the last couple decades, I suppose, I was part of the authorship team for the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 2 report, which looked at vulnerability and impacts of climate change. It's a big international report. Myself and a colleague from Mauritania, we organized a group of a dozen international scientists, and we assessed the impacts of climate change on human health, well-being, migration, mobility, and conflict. And this is the document that governments use when they meet at their annual climate change meetings. The next one will be taking place at the end of this month in the UAE. And so that's, and that again, I was able to get some Laurier students participating as research assistants in the generation of that report. And it's really cool to me that if you ever look at this thing and you look at the acknowledgements, you'll see the names of a couple Laurier undergrad students and Wilfrid Laurier University right in there. So a lot of Canadian universities don't get a chance to show the flag like that. Anyhow, Eric, that's about enough about me. So why don't I turn it back to you in the panel? Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. And your research sounds fantastic in building that kind of rapport at that level that you're talking about. So thank you for sharing that, because that's really impactful to the audience. Before I pass things over to Denise to close things off in terms of our more fulsome introductions, I wanted to challenge the audience. We have over 50 people attending this afternoon. We have a couple of questions that are in the queue now. We're trending to be about 15 minutes to do a full Q&A. So if we have an opportunity to answer as many questions as possible, please provide them to us. So Denise, we're going to pass it over to you to let us know more about what you do here.
Okay, so thank you so much. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I am in the English and Film Studies department, and I've kind of structured this presentation around the question of what does literature have to do with climate justice? So we can go to the next slide. Basically, my goal here is to walk you all through with me the journey from me wanting to study LGBT representation in young adult literature to being a crunchy hippie that just wants to teach people how to sew. So my research centers around the question of how literature for and about young people creates a space in which to model and imagine more ethical and sustainable relationships to ourselves, to each other, and to what I'm calling the more than human world. So we can go to the next slide. So where this question kind of started, I tried to pinpoint the origin of it. And certainly most of my inspiration for wanting to pursue graduate work came from my just profound love for the queer YA lit that I read as a teenager. One example, the sort of main example, is Will Grayson by John Green and David Levithan. If you're familiar with The Fault in Our Stars, it was really popular about 10 years ago. John Green is the author of that, and he wrote half of Will Grayson. And the sort of climax of that novel centers around this question that a teenage boy asks to his friend, since when does the person you want to screw have to be the only person you get to love? And that question has stuck with me for years, clearly, because now I'm doing a PhD on it. And it really inspired me to sort of question what models of love and happiness are we oriented towards, and how can we maybe find more fulfilling alternatives to maybe like really rigid structures of like what success might look like for growing up. And in terms of where I think I can pinpoint the sort of initial climate justice in literature question, near the end of my master's program, in one of my courses, we studied a poetry collection called Niche. And the final poem in that collection asks the question, like, who will miss us when we're gone? And I have a small excerpt from it. And the excerpt references, the crows and the, trying to remember. I'm blind, for those of you that don't know, so I can't read it out loud. So it's the crows and the maggots and basically all of these sort of like scavenger animals. They'll miss our mess, like they'll miss the trash. And this poem just stuck with me. And it really made me wonder, like, what language and what stories can do in terms of helping us conceptualize our relationship to the environment broadly, but, like thinking about animals and maybe humans aren't the center of the universe, and how can we sort of get beyond this thinking that humans are sort of the only people that have anything to like lose or gain in the world. So we can go to the next slide, please. Then came 2020. I feel like I don't need to provide the context of what happened around March of 2020, but suffice it to say that we all needed to wear masks. And the sort of really immediate need to mask ourselves in order to protect each other was so profoundly like felt in my family. There's some immunocompromised people. And so my mom and I decided that we didn't want to just buy disposable masks because that seemed like, unnecessary trash and also unnecessary cost. And my mom knows how to sew. She tried to teach me when I was little. I didn't have the patience for it. But we decided now's as good a time as any. Let's crank out some masks. And we did. And we made so many masks. Turns out mask sewing is a fantastic way to learn sewing because it's basically just a rectangle. So that really inspired me it really empowered me, I suppose. It inspired and empowered me to think about how the clothes that we wear, the things that we put on our bodies, can be maintained and cared for and made in ways that they will last us or last other people a really, really long time. And it's an alternative to sort of relying on not just fast fashion, but relying on, buying a piece of clothing from any brand, whether it's H&M or, Reformation is like a really kind of well-known sustainable clothing brand. And one of the YouTubers that I particularly enjoy, her tutorials, her name is Bernadette Banner. She published a book, I believe last year. I'm trying to think, it could have been early this year. And it's called Make, Sew, and Mend. And she basically has these fantastic, well-photographed instructions for all these different various hand sewing techniques so that you can learn how to make your own clothes and home goods, as well as mend and maintain them so that if something gets a rip, a tear, or it starts to pill, you have the skills and the tools to mend that thing and, extend its life and its utility. And also you can alter clothing from your own wardrobe or from a thrift store or something to fit your body, your style, and your hopes and dreams. So we'll go to the last slide, please. And that sort of led to, we all had to come back to campus post-lockdown. And I really struggled for about a year with this question of like, why am I even still doing this PhD? Because are books even really that important anymore? We've just survived, the inset of a pandemic. Forests are on fire, the world is burning. And trying to recover my sense of joy and hope really emerged from reaching out to the sustainability office and asking if I could just get involved. So I cold emailed Dan McGregor and said, I'm really interested in slow fashion and I'd like to do some programming around it. So he was incredibly supportive. And since then, I've been able to make a ton of really fantastic connections with Sustainability Office, Ellisburg, and the Laurier Library Makerspace. Last year, I organized and facilitated 2 sewing workshops, one of them more focused on hand sewing in the fall, one of them focused on machine sewing in the winter. And I also kind of like to sprinkle in those workshops the intersectionality of like why might this benefit people who maybe don't conform to a gender binary? Why might this be an opportunity for people of color, to express themselves in ways that aren't, confined by what the mall decides we should all be wearing? And I have loved that work, and it's really brought sort of my spark back. So I do have some photos from the second workshop. And you're welcome to ask me to teach you how to sew in the makerspace at any time. I'll happily do so. And currently I'm sitting on the Menstrual Equity Committee, and that sort of bridges, we can make sustainable period products, we can make accessories for our sustainable period products, hence the drawstring bag. It's a way of storing your menstrual cup. And I'm hoping to, in the coming months, run some more like education and awareness building around how to menstruate in a less ecologically harmful way and a more equitable way. So that's what I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Denise. And we've enjoyed working with you throughout the time that we've both been here. And I'm glad to hear that your spark is back. So thank you for sharing that with our panelists and with our audience. So now we're on to the question period. We got 15 minutes. We're going to give Amanda and CU the last 2 minutes at the back end. We've received about 6 questions. I'm actually going to start with Robert, because I know, Robert, you got back-to-back again after this. And so I wanted to make sure your questions are asked first. It's a combination of 2 questions. The first one is, where can we find your reports? So if you wanted to provide us with a link to that to send out afterwards, or you can provide it as a link to the chat through all of the participants. You can either go through Amanda and CU for that. The other question is, how have students taking your sustainability courses been teaching, that you've been teaching, changed since you began teaching it? And are they still hopeful?
Wow, that's a lot of questions for one person. And so, yeah, I'll go through them as quickly as I can to make sure I leave time for the other panelists. And yeah, I do have to teach my second year students in a little bit. But a couple things. One is, I'll start with the last question first. Yeah, I've learned a lot just from interacting with my students over the years. In terms of hopefulness, yes, I remain hopeful, very hopeful indeed. And the reason is that the pathways to a cleaner future are right in front of us. In fact, when I started doing this research, a lot of the technologies that we take for granted today that we can go and purchase, we're still in their sort of early stages of innovation. And so, for example, today, homeowners that want to get rid of their gas or oil furnaces, there are heat pumps that are comparable in price that they can install. There are electric and zero emissions vehicles out there. They're not as environmentally friendly as public transportation, but for those folks who don't have access to public transportation, there are increasingly affordable zero emissions or low emissions vehicles to purchase. And there's all kinds of other technologies that are coming on stream as well. When I first started teaching, Ontario burned coal to generate electricity. We don't anymore. So these are very tangible milestones along the way. Now, don't get me wrong, we got a long way to go. But as I tell my students, we're at the point in time where everything we need to get the job done is pretty much falling into place. So we're at that point where we need to either lead, follow, or get out of the way. And so that's my advice to young people: be a leader or be a follower. Please don't get in the way, stand aside. But more importantly, let's make sure that our political leaders, our business leaders, our academic leaders, our campus leaders are part of the solution and not part of the problem. And the nice thing to wrap up about here at Laurier is that there's far more people who are trying to be part of the solution than part of the problem. And I give a shout out here, obviously, to the Laurier Library for putting on an event like this, but also to groups like the EcoHawks on campus, my fellow panelists who are doing great work. We're going down the right path. And I will put a little link in the chat to my Google Scholar profile, and people can download as much material as they want that I've written. A lot of it'll put you to sleep, I'm afraid, but you're welcome to have a look. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Robert. That's a great response to that. So Amanda and CU will also make sure that that gets sent out. The next question is actually for Danve. So Danve, the question for you is from, you answered it to Jenny directly, but her question was that you've been interested in how climate warming is affecting plants and working on possible solutions for that. What about climate weirding?
That's actually an important question, and indeed, my lab has been focusing on warming temperatures, but there are lots of other groups all over the world wherein emerging research has started in looking at other environmental factors associated with climate change, like increased drought and then additional stresses in terms of salinity or salt stress in the soil, or even changes in humidity, precipitation, and flooding. And indeed, immune responses, it's quite central to my work, but it's only one component of plant biology. So other groups are looking at impacts on growth, development, phenology, so like plant life cycle, and other aspects of their stress physiology. So it's quite an exciting period to be in, like lots of discoveries to be uncovered, and like some challenges to overcome, but it's an exciting area of research in the plant sciences.
Perfect. Thank you, Danve. This next question was actually directed to all speakers, but I wanted to give questions to each one of you individually. Bryce, this question's for you. What do we tell our kids, our friends, when we experience feelings of hopelessness as we see political leaders making decisions that don't support a viable climate future? It's a tough question, but I'd love to hear what you say on this one.
Well, I think just it's all hands on deck, and I think what we see is a lot of that happening. Maybe more because we're in it, but there's a lot of cool research going on. There's a lot, as Robert was mentioning, there's a lot of technology. There's a lot of things that are progressing the way, getting us along. And I'm hopeful that, and I remain hopeful that will continue to happen. My friend always asks this question came up to me when I was in like undergrad, talking to my friend about climate change, and he sort of said, and it's always stuck with me, it's kind of weird, but he said, you don't know what a dog can do till you get it in the corner. So in other words, in terms of climate change, we might, we're going to experience changes. We got, pressures coming at us or whatever, but you kind of, I think that there's always hope. We might have to do some adaptation or, some different things along the way. But certainly that's where I always remain hopeful in that. I think, I don't know, you got to kind of maintain that hope, I think, to move forward. There's no use just getting down in the dumps about stuff like that. And just be positive about the work that's going on in across all sectors and all fields. And I think slowly and surely we're kind of getting there. So that's what I would say anyways.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bryce. It's actually a good segue to the next question, which is to Denise. What is the role of joy and relationship building in the sustainability movement?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I think that joy and relationship building can inject sustainability into sustainability activism. And I'll unpack what that means a little bit, because we can think about sustainability in terms of, less plastic in the ocean, finding more renewable resources. But we also need to remember that humans need connection in order to keep the big picture in mind, that what they're doing is worthwhile. And so if that big picture is that I have people in my life that I love, I have animals in my life that I love to cohabitate, there's probably a cat running around somewhere in my background. Finding joy is, I think, really integral to maybe not preventing those moments of hopelessness, but certainly having sort of tools in order to not live in the hopelessness.
Fantastic. Thanks, Denise. This next question, I'm going to open it up to our panelists to see if anybody would like to take it, because it's not directed at anybody specific, but it is a specific question. One of the potential concerns with climate change is an impact to food systems, both in the global north and the global south. Is research and funding on climate resilient plants and ecosystems progressing fast enough? And is the research distributed equitably to mitigate food impacts to the global south? I don't know if anybody wants to take that one. Danve, go ahead. Yeah, please. Thank you.
I'll try to take a stab. I mean, of course, I'm not an expert within the current research funding landscape globally. So, of course, like, there can always be more that can be done, but there are new initiatives. A lot of them are based in the US. So the Harnessing Plants Initiative in order to use plants as carbon sequestration technology. And I believe the Gates Foundation has really been focusing on global South initiatives for sustainable food systems. So those are the ones that I'm currently aware of. And within Canada, there are certain grants from the International Development Research Center. So there are certain calls for sustainable agriculture and food system with a focus on developing countries. But again, I feel like we need to do more. And I think the current structure of nationally organized and almost siloed funding agencies has slightly hampered some of this more trans and international collaborative opportunities.
Thank you. Open if anybody else would like to take a stab at that answer. Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to give a shout out to my colleagues here in the Geography and Environmental Studies Department. We have a group that works on sustainable food systems here. We have a UNESCO chair, Alison Blade Palmer, who does a lot of research with international scholars, groups of scholars on sustainable food systems. We do a lot of work in the Northern Territories here in Canada. So there's a lot of good work being done. And I'm sure there's other colleagues here at Laurier that I'm just not familiar with the work they're doing, but there's a lot of great research being done here. And I think that the question is a valid one, in that when we look at food systems, the problem is not so much at this moment in time a food supply problem. There's plenty of calories being produced by food systems around the world, but there's a food distribution and a food equity problem that we have, and that there's a lot of people who aren't getting access to high quality food. And so there's a lot of work both on the natural science and the social sciences that we can do better. And I know some of the stuff that Bryce is doing, it doesn't sound like it's a big deal working with small scale maple syrup producers, but it's both a food security system and a livelihood security system, especially in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. So I think just in what I've heard on this panel, there's a lot of interesting jumping off points that Laurier folks are doing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Robert. For the next question, it's actually directed to Bryce. How has environmental dispossession impacted intergenerational resilience with Indigenous communities? How has this impacted traditional Indigenous knowledges and observations that are more sensitive to identifying environmental changes from climate change at a local level?
That's a good question. A lot of that, so through some of our work, through work led by Brenda Murphy and Annette Chrétien that I mentioned on maple syrup, part of what they did was look at maple syrup production in Aboriginal communities. A lot of that has been lost. A lot of that knowledge and that oral history has been lost and diminished over the years. And there is a real push on Aboriginal communities or Indigenous communities to, to bring back some of that knowledge. For example, this is from a few years ago now. But there's a community just towards like Cape Croker, just up near Bruce Peninsula, and there's a group there that was trying to reinvigorate their maple syrup production, like start producing maple syrup again on the reserve, and use that again, using it in different, not necessarily using it in ways in terms of like economically selling the syrup, but using the syrup and the sap as ways of teaching their traditional practices that have been lost over, since colonialism, all those sorts of things. So really there's kind of this feeling that knowledge is very much power. And I think that was one of the real interesting kind of finding, or real kind of interesting aspects of the maple syrup research that I've sort of experienced as a obviously settler person. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting reports and things that are available on our website. It's resilientresearch.ca. Some of that stuff is produced on there, and there's probably lots more I just can't think of off the top of my head, but really I think that's certainly one way is that of that knowledge being really important, and just the different values and different ways of knowing that. It's all very interesting stuff. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Bryce. The last question I'm going to ask is going to go to Denise. I wanted to make sure each panelist got a chance to answer 2 questions. I know we had a limited time on the Q&A side, but I'm glad that we're able to do that. Denise, it's a 2-parter. It's 2 different questions combined. So I'll ask the first one first. What fiction book would you recommend a young reader, ages 10 to 12, to learn more about equity and how to help the environment? And then the other question is, how do we make slow fashion sexier and more appealing, especially because it involves consuming less?
Oh, okay. So I think I have 2 recommendations for books. So neither is explicitly about environmentalism with a capital E, but I would recommend Hazel's Theory of Evolution, which is by Lisa Jen Bigelow. And I can provide links to this as well after to Amanda and Sue so that it can be circulated with the package. And I would also recommend, in terms of a book that does a really great job of modeling conversations about, what equity can look like, and what, coming to equity from a place of curiosity rather than from a place of defensiveness might look like. It's called Harbor Me, and that's by Jacqueline Woodson. So those are my book recommendations. And then, how do we make slow fashion sexy? Slow fashion is sexy. So we have to start from that perspective. And I think that the thing that makes slow fashion so exciting, and if we want to call it sexy, we'll call it sexy, cool, is that you have so much power and creativity over your clothing when you know and you have access to the tools to customize it. So especially when it comes to having your clothing like fit your body in a way that you feel really empowered and really incredible and confident. That fit might not be what, a big brand is able to churn out mass production. And so I think that, looking at what really cool creative people are doing with their clothes and taking inspiration from that can be a place of, finding the sexiness in slow fashion, because people are super creative and they're super innovative, and that's definitely what I find really inspiring. Like, we don't all have to look the same, we don't all have to wear the same thing when we know how to sew or how to use a fabric dye, or any fill in the blank, any like textile skill you want to learn, you can learn it.
Perfect. Thanks, Denise. I'm going to pass things back to Amanda to close off our panel.
Thanks, Eric. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their research and insights today, and also thank you to Eric, for moderating the panel. I'd also like to thank CU, Charlotte, and Alip at the library, and Kat, Dina, and Dan at the Sustainability Office for their efforts at putting this event together. A link to the recording will be sent out to all registered participants, and will also include links to all of our panelists and all the amazing work that they're doing. So thank you so much for helping us participate in Climate Action Week and for joining us today. And we hope to run similar panels in the future. So thank you so much.